Hey there and welcome back to another Rings of Power video. And we're almost up to date, so just bear with me. And today we'll be talking about episode 7, The Eye, which follows up on the cliffhanger ending of the eruption of Mount Doom and the immense cloud of ash descending upon the Southlands and the united human army that had assembled in the village. A lot of big plot points are set up in this episode that lead into the epic finale that we'll talk about very soon, including some pretty big character reveals. But anyway, with all that being said, let's jump into the episode. So, as I said, we start off the episode looking at the immediate aftermath of the eruption of the volcano. And, okay, so somehow a lot of people have survived this stage. Sure they did. Wouldn't everybody at this point be dead? Like, I'm not a volcanologist, but when the ash cloud, or the pyroclastic flow as it's apparently called, descended upon Pompeii, it incinerated everything in its path, including people. Studies apparently show that the majority of the people who died in Pompeii died as a result of the heat of this flow. And this is exactly what's happening to this little wooden village and all the fleshy people inside it, at least I'm pretty certain. But yet there's so many survivors. Guess I'll have to suspend my disbelief on that one. And that's not even to mention how toxic this air would have suddenly become. But anyway, Galadriel wakes up and we see the aftermath, burning horses and burning people. Corpses littering the streets, the town obliterated, people trapped in burning buildings. Pretty much the apocalypse. Anyway, Galadriel searches for Halbrand and Elendil, but she can't find them. But she does find Theo, of all people, who's also unable to find his loved ones. And so, it seems like the two of them just straight up leave. Like, they just leave a guy only a few meters away to burn to death. That's rough. But anyway, we then get a look at Isildur, who's trying to help his friend, the useful friend, who's been trapped underneath some debris. But he can't lift it alone. But luckily the Queen's walking past and she helps him, and together they pull him out. Only to discover that their other friend, the one who is less useful, is also dead. And honestly, not surprising whatsoever. Dude had a massive death flag, and I'm shocked he even survived the battle at all. The newly formed trio then hear a bunch of screams from within the burning building with a very unstable roof, and so the Queen and Isildur enter the building to try and help a mother and her kids. But the roof comes down, and Isildur dies, whilst the Queen gets embers in her eyes. And honestly, this death fake out, not a fan. When you use a character that obviously survives to do your fake out, it really does remove most of the emotion and the tension, but maybe that's just me. Moving on, we then get a look at the Halfwoods who have arrived at the Grove, only to find that big portions of it have been destroyed by the eruption of Mount Doom, with many of their fruit trees burnt and their produce charred and ashy. Not exactly the homecoming they were hoping for. And so, since the Halfwoods have really come around on the dude since he saved them from the wolves, they ask Nori to get the obvious Gandalf to try and fix things with his magic, but Nori's still very scared of him after he accidentally hurt her, so she isn't really willing to try and get him to help them at all. And so instead, Mr. Burrows goes over to ask for help. And it sort of works, I suppose, after all. He uses his magic to try and heal the tree, and whilst he does almost crush to death that idiot child with a fallen branch, after everybody leaves, the tree does start to bloom again. But of course, now all the Halfwoods don't like him, including Nori. Fair weather friend much? The dude completely saved your family from getting left behind and dying. And he also beat off those wolves. Come on. But then it's off to Moria, where Elrond is making his plea to allow the elves access to the dwarves' closed-off mithril mines. And in exchange, the elves would basically provide the city with all its food and timber needs for 500 years. And since the upper limit of a dwarven lifespan in Lord of the Rings is around 250 years apparently, this means generations will come and go under this new golden age, where their people are going to be provided for, and thus can dedicate themselves to other pursuits. And on top of that, also just get rich off mithril. The elves can't use it all. They can't possibly need every single scrap of it, so it seems like a fairly decent deal, all things considered. The Dwarf King, though, he's less convinced by the spiel. He has a number of big qualms. One, why should he trust the elves to keep their word? And two, why should he risk so many dwarven lives simply to extend elven immortality? Elrond then humbles himself before the king and kneels to him, which I doubt the king was expecting from an elf, so really this is a good plan, and he begs him to reconsider. And so, the Dwarf King does consider it, and has a private word with his son, and honestly this whole scene, that was great. The king became one of the best acted characters in this show. There was this insane Shakespearean gravitas behind his whole speech where he talks about how everything has its time, everything must come to ash, and thus he's not going to risk his people for a hopeless cause. If it's the will of the Valar for the elves to fade and flee Middle-earth, who is he to question that? And so he refuses, and honestly, it's a very epic scene. But yeah, it's also sad because he is condemning the elves, but I get why he does it. It's not like you can hate him all that much for it. But regardless, Disa doesn't really take all of this very well at all, and when Durin tells her about his father's decision, she rages. But like he said, there's not much they can do. He is the king, and there's no way to defy him in a way that doesn't compromise their family. And so he has to tell Elrond no. And I kind of think Elrond was expecting that answer, but, he's still sad. And so then they have an emotional goodbye, where Elrond does the classic, we don't say goodbye, but insert other word for goodbye right here trope. A tried and tested classic to make the audience feel very sad. And then he leaves, with poor Durin having a cry holding his little chunk of mithril, which then heals the leaf from the tree at Lindon that Elrond had left behind. So this shows that it isn't just a theoretical cure. It actually legitimately works. And so now, instead of weighing the lives of his people against a maybe, against a hope, it's confirmed that this does work, that this will save the elves. And so his resolve hardens, and he calls out for Elrond so they can come up with a plan. But then it's back to Theo and Galadriel in the Southlands, where, they really did just walk off and abandon everybody to die. It's a bit rude. But there are orcs wandering through the newly formed wasteland in search of survivors they can murder. Understandably, Theo is less than enthused at the prospect of just letting his homeland be destroyed and usurped by the orcs, and he wants to fight back. But he's physically subdued by Galadriel, who tells him, tough luck, kid, you lost. Your land's gone, it's time to go. Which, I guess she's right, and they are in dangerous territory, so I get why she's a bit abrupt with him here, but Jesus. But he would just end up getting himself killed by the orcs, and nothing would be achieved except he'd be dead, and potentially her alongside him. And meanwhile, the remnants of the Númenórean army are fleeing through the charred woods to their base camp, which is outside the reach of the disaster zone. And of course, there's all the fallout from this failed attack. Elendil sees Beric the horse, and assumes that Isildur will be the man leading him, but it turns out to be some random extra. And then Isildur's friend arrives to tell him, bad luck man, your son's probably dead. And then they also realise, for that double gut punch, that the Queen is now mostly blind. So yes, a very successful mission all round. Big portion of the army's dead, the land is destroyed and blighted forever, the orcs win the overall campaign and conquer the Southlands, and the future ruler of the kingdom was seriously injured. Can't get much worse than this from where I'm sitting. And whilst this is all happening, Theo and Galadriel are just still wandering through the wasteland. Theo laments the probable death of his friends and his mother, and the obliteration of his people, and then celebrates the deaths that Galadriel has inflicted upon the orcs over the years she's been fighting them. But she pulls him back from that abyss, saying that he shouldn't fill his heart with darkness and revenge, and that during war, a soldier has to also fight a war within themselves to prevent them from walking a dark path. Pretty much telling the kid, don't be like me, trust me, it sucks. I did not expect this cool aunt vibe that she was giving off before this episode, but I have to admit, it really does add a fair bit to her character overall, because at times she can feel a little bit one note. But this gives her a sort of third dimension. And then she gives him her sword, and now this kid, you can see in his eyes, is ride or die for this woman. See, this is how she should have been talking to her elven allies back when they were hunting Sauron, as opposed to being, a bit of a harsh taskmaster. Maybe she would have maintained some of that loyalty a bit longer. And then it's back to the Halfwoods, where Mr. Burrows is sending Gandalf on his way, telling him to head up to the forests of Greenwood the Great and to find the human settlements on the far side, who should be able to help him find the stars he needs. But to not get his hopes up, because those constellations don't appear in any of the regions of Middle-earth the Halfwoods frequent. And in fact, they haven't been seen for thousands of years, so good luck finding them, mate. See you later, haha! And then Nori gives him an apple and says nothing to him, and so off he goes into the big wide world. Whilst Nori bitches about what a terrible decision she made. Like, what? You regret helping this guy? Seriously? Why? He saved you countless times. If he'd never been found, they would have been eaten by those wolves. What an absolute whiner. Get a grip, kid. Get an absolute grip. Her mum thinks so too. We then return to Galadriel and Theo, where Theo is asking very invasive questions about whether in her extremely long life, anybody important to her has died. And first, she mentions her brother Finrod, who was slaughtered by Sauron's minions, and guess she doesn't care about her other two brothers who were canonically fighting evil as well, and were killed in those battles, but they don't get a mention, I guess. And then she also says that her husband Celeborn is dead, or at least she thinks he is, because he obviously isn't, as he later appears in Lord of the Rings. Regardless, it's nice that he hasn't been completely forgotten, and clearly they do have some sort of story for him. But for the plot of Season 1, obviously she needed to be alone, and what kind of husband would he be if he just abandoned her like that? And so judging by how these things usually go, he's going to either be in prison somewhere, or have amnesia. But regardless of what choice they make, it does feel a little bit cliche. But other than him being a piece of shit, staying away for all these years, there really isn't another option for how they deal with this. And so, after Galadriel's also quite unhelpful to Theo by telling him there's a grand plan at work and forces other than evil in this world, so basically, don't be sad your people got genocided, it's God's will. Cringe. They then notice orcs approaching, and seriously, Galadriel is an elf. How did she not hear them coming until the exact same moment that Theo hears them coming? You have those pointy ears, Galadriel. Use them! But anyway, there's a moment of tension where it seems like they might get discovered by the orcs and forced to fight, but it ends up coming to nothing, with the orcs moving along, before they rest for the night. And we at last return to the mines where Elrond and Durin are a two-man wrecking crew, smashing through rocks to try and get to that delicious mithril underneath. Well, you can't say that Durin isn't a true friend, risking it all and putting his life on the line in a dangerous mine to buy Elrond and his people more time to keep being immortal and building paradise on Middle-earth. And then there's yet another sweet scene between these two, which is one part fun, brotherly banter, and one part sweet bromance. Anyway, they then manage to stumble across a whole heap of mithril, veins and veins of it, running all the way down into the dark, and I wonder what could be down there. Annoyingly though, we then have yet another instance of an elf somehow getting easily snuck up on, as the king has managed to find his way down there, with guards, with neither of them noticing, giving Elrond a one-way trip to the exit, and taking his son to his chambers to yell at him. And he gives him the mightiest disappointed dad speech of all time, referencing how when he was a baby, they weren't sure Durin would live, and they gave up hope for him, but that he'd had a vision of young Durin growing to be a glorious and mighty king with a big grey beard, and so he would tend to him all through the night to ease his pain. But now he's gone and done this. And of course, Durin thinks otherwise, and says that his father's pretty much full of shit, that he speaks of greatness, and yet he squashes down his son's ambition. And then he mentions how Elrond's like a brother to him, which insults the king because he's offended on his wife's behalf, and so he disinherits his son. Whew, damn. And so we return to the Halfwoods. And what do you know? Turns out Gandalf healed the trees with his magic, and so now the grove is lush and bountiful. Bet they'll be wishing they kept him around at this point. But anyway, turns out those cultists are still on his trail, and have made it to the grove. And so, when they're about to leave and go off in search of him, Nori, does she just betray his ass and tell them where he went? Seriously? Imagine seeing that this guy restored your garden, and then you sell him out to the very obviously dangerous looking people. But anyway, in a moment of karmic justice, the obvious villains do an obviously villainous thing, and burn their wagons and food. And that's what you get, Nori. That's what you get. And so it's back to the Southlands where Elendil's having extreme buyer's remorse from having pulled Galadriel out of the sea, as it's ended up with his son getting killed by an unexpected volcanic eruption. Honestly, I'm struggling to see how she should have predicted that this was going to happen though, and plus, in the end, shouldn't he also blame the Queen? It's not like Galadriel forced him to go and fight. Obviously, this misplaced anger is going to be a part of his arc and he will overcome it, but still, I feel like it's the Queen that he should be more frustrated with. I know that she's blind now, so I guess that sort of explains it a bit, but hey, dude needs to chill a bit. But at least Theo and Galadriel arrive back and Theo gets his happy reunion with his mum and with Arondir, because now apparently they're close enough to hug. Okay, sure, why not? Galadriel then has an audience with the Queen Regent, who's planning on heading back to Numenor, leaving a few soldiers behind to assist the Southlanders moving somewhere safe, whilst also searching for any missing soldiers. But anyway, despite being blinded and her forces smashed, the Queen Regent decides to activate Chad mode and tells Galadriel that she's coming back. But this time, with more soldiers to whoop some orcish ass, to end their threat to Middle-earth once and for all, with Galadriel vowing that the elves too will be coming with an army of their own. While Elendil just cries. And fair enough, of all the named and important characters, he lost everything that matters in this trip. Yeah, the Queen's blind, but his son's dead. And then back in Numenor, he's already estranged from his first son, and his daughter is also just going to hate him now for leading Isildur to his death when she was firmly against the invasion in the first place. Dude's going to have a very rough opening half of Season 2. Back to the Halfwoods though, we see them all weeping about their carts being destroyed, only for Nori's dad to give a speech about staying true to each other, which in turn reminds Nori that she betrayed her friends and she should probably go help him. And thus she, Poppy, her mum, and Mr. Burrows go off to find him. And also, I haven't really touched on this before, but some of these accents for the Halfwoods are rough. Particularly the mums, like wow, how did this not get dubbed over? It's $60 million an episode. We then move on to what is in hindsight a massive neon sign saying, "Do not trust this dude," as after the Queen sets sail, Galadriel is told Halbrand is alive and is laying wounded in a tent. Of course, nobody saw him get wounded, and they found him alone on the road. And now, conveniently, only elvish medicine will save him. And so off they go to Eregion, where Halbrand totally isn't going to aid in the construction of the Rings of Power. Totally not. Even without the hindsight, though, it did kind of feel obvious who he was at the time. But anyway, they ride off all epic-like, with the Southlanders cheering for their king. It's going to be awkward when they see who he really is, isn't it? Waldrick's going to love it, though. We then return to Moria, where what starts as a wife giving her husband a pep talk to not let his father get him down, turns into, well, it kind of felt like a thinly veiled suggestion that his father needs to be put to the side as king, that perhaps it's time for new blood to take the throne, that they will rule together as the greatest king and queen Dwarvenkind has ever seen. Sounds pretty dangerous to me, kind of greedy as well. And simply based on this, wouldn't be surprised if she's one of the people that gets the Dwarven rings, the 7. After all, don't they amplify greed in lore? So I wouldn't be shocked based on that. And the audience already cares about it quite a lot, so I think it adds to the stakes of things. Meanwhile, the Balrog is also stirring deep within the Mithril mine, awoken by the leaf that Elrond had, before we see the final transformation of the Southlands into Mordor, to finish off with that evil vibe. And so, that's really the end of the episode, and I'll be honest, this one, it didn't do it for me as much. It was fun, but also you can tell it was just there to bridge the gap between the battle and the finale. So not much happened, and everybody was just pretty much being put in place to wrap up their storylines. It was good, but it could have been better. And so, with all that being said, these are just my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of the episode? You like it, hate it? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.